We've had three really fascinating presentations, and I just thought I'd start off with a question that the panel might consider while you're formulating the questions that you might want to pose to our presenters. And that's the question essentially of trying to understand education, not as something that a system does and delivers, but education quite clearly from the presentations is something that a society provides. Now, if that's the case, then how are the mechanisms, let's say if you're working at a grassroots level, how do you get to also participate and shape national policy spaces? That might be an interesting kind of issue. Certainly I know Plan International that had worked very locally once they'd moved to sector-wide policy making, aid negotiations, found themselves not in national spaces, and it actually meant that the members of Plan actually had to really rethink about even how they worked at a national level. So there's some interesting issues and challenges about being heard at different scales. So the plan for the next, just short of half an hour, because we'll have to have some transition time into the next keynote address, so we've got about 25 minutes, is to gather up some questions. We need you to have access to the mic because it's being recorded. So 2 to 3 questions, or 2 questions actually, because we'll have 2 mics, potentially 3 might be a bit too, so 2 questions. Can you also say your name so we have an idea of where you come from? The floor is yours. There's a question here. Is there a second question? There's a question there, and then there's a question right at the back. Colleen.
Hi, I'm Leni, and I'm also a PhD student from the Faculty of Education at Cambridge. And actually, I'm also researching a series of, say, grassroots organizations in the UK, initiated by immigrants to deliver some language education to the next generation. And the feedback I get from the field is that these people are very concerned about standardization of all sorts of teaching practices and also assessments and also accreditation of this kind of education. So my question is, what mechanisms are in place to measure or monitor the educational outcomes or progresses that your NGOs seek to deliver? And related to that, in what ways are these, say, outcomes or accreditation taken up by, say, the stakeholders that you serve? For example, some children and also their parents.
Okay. There's a second question over here.
Hello, everyone. My name is Aleki from University of Reading. Just to follow up that question, you mentioned the mechanism for control the quality as well as performance measurement. So I would ask an actual mechanism you might use in your practice. How will you motivate or the incentive your volunteers to do a good job for your services? Okay. Thank you.
Question just at the back, so we'll go to the third question, and then we'll ask the panel to respond.
Hello, Colleen McLaughlin, Faculty of Education. Those were 3 very powerful presentations. Simple question, should organizations like the Faculty of Education or other organizations such as those get involved in supporting the sort of work that you're doing? And if so, how?
So 3 questions. Who would like to start? Okay.
So I think actually the first question about measurement and the last question about universities strikes me as quite connected. I think one of the most powerful ways that universities are getting involved in the work of NGOs, both grassroots and international, is through helping to establish viable mechanisms for measurement and to ensure that those results can be disseminated both across the academic community and then ideally, within our organizations and to the wider education development community. So I know, I've been contributing to the work of the Real Center at the Faculty of Education, and that's a lot of what they do is to try to bring some of those, those most up-to-date forms of measurement and to ensure rigor and reliability in the monitoring and evaluation that the work of NGOs is doing. I think monitoring and evaluation for NGOs is something that's relatively new. You could question me on that. But I think only recently have we felt so inclined to really make that at the forefront of our work to ensure that we are both research-based and data-driven. And I think that oftentimes we lack the expertise to do so. And so by collaborating with universities, you know, I think it really uplifts the quality of what's happening. Do either of you have a...
Yeah, I would completely agree with that. A lot of what Student Hub's work does try to do is connect university students who can bring a lot of expertise from their faculties and research from faculties with local charities who don't necessarily have the capacity or the experience in impact measurement or monitoring to do so. So, yeah, one of our programs is called Impact Labs. We train PhD students in basic impact measurement skills and then send them to various charities who come with a particular brief of their impact that they'd like an assessment for. And the charities do find that hugely useful because it's this bridging that divide between academia and practice. So I would agree with you on that, definitely. Yeah,
Yeah, I would. Yeah, and I'll also add to that in the sense that I think what academia can really help is to really identify what practices work, and that's what we've been sharing here today. And also that adapting some of the international practices to more like different cultural settings. For example, some of the psychometrics that we're using, we're very thankful that, for example, for Chinese youth, we find the Chinese positive youth development scale that's out there, that's developed by professionals that we can use to measure our outcomes. But we can't do that as an NGO. We can't develop a scale and test it and bring it to different cultural settings ourselves. So I think it's really important that educators and experts could work on that. And yes.
Of the two other questions, are you happy to, who wants to pick up either of those questions?
Yeah, I can go for about incentivising volunteers. It is actually a really positive response, especially for Schools Plus, from Cambridge University volunteers. I think because a lot of people are quite acutely aware of the kind of reputation that Cambridge has for not necessarily being that socially diverse. Especially, I think a lot of students who have got through to Cambridge University and studying maybe from not especially privileged backgrounds, I think definitely aware of that, coming to study and then want to give something back. So, yeah, we've just been generally really impressed by the motivation from the students.
I think the case is a little bit different in Guangzhou, where actually college students and even high school students, they are incentivized by the school system actually to do extracurriculum activities and to do community service. But the problem is, how do you channel that to, you know, like they want their own scores and they want their own evaluations, but how do we get them to do what we hope them to do? Actually, that would be the difficult part. So we have our training 101 and facilitator training and everything to make sure that they understand why we're doing it, like why we're mobilizing, why we're actually spending time and energy and money to do this, and what's the value of it. So I guess instead of incentivizing, I would rather say to make sure that they're on board with us, with the value of our work. And then I think they will move from there. Yeah.
And finally, should education faculties be involved quite explicitly in supporting your activities? Who would like to take that?
I think we maybe covered some of that answer in the previous question in terms of like the university faculty's excellence is in the research and helping organisations who are perhaps more involved in practicing that.
Yeah, and actually, maybe not only from the education faculty, actually, from public policy, sociology, anyone, actually, I would think
Medicine,
that...
engineering?
yes, also, yes.
I mean, one of the dangers, of course, is potentially volunteer tourism, and that's an interesting issue. I've been in Cambodia, where the kind of risks for, let's say, the volunteer are managed by how far you are from the centre. So much more peripheral communities actually find that the volunteer doesn't end up there because the view is that the insurance risks and so on. So you can kind of think on that one. Can we go to another round of questions? Hand up, and we can get the mic to you, and just say your name. Question at the back and a question right at the back.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Elizabeth. I'm a student at the Faculty of Education. My question is is about the whole idea of girls' education and empowerment. I think it is when we see that girls are marginalized and they face barriers to go into education, it is not because of the girls, right? It's because of larger social structures that keep girls out of schools. It's because of patriarchy, structures of oppression, and so on. How does CamFed try to address those issues if only working with girls? Because getting societies to understand the importance of educating girls is very much also about the boys. So leaving the boys out of the conversation, how can we ever hope to really change those structures that keep girls out of education?
Great question. Another one at the back.
Hi, thank you. I'm Ji from Faculty of Education. I have a question based on the previous discussions about research and the involvement of research, universities, and volunteers into your organizations. I wonder if you have any kind of a mechanism to mobilize the parents and the communities of your students. Because I'm asking because especially, I guess, for example, in Xiang's case, I think maybe a lot of those parents are quite unschooled or even illiterate. So do you have any kind of those kind of mechanisms? Thank you.
Okay, we'll take those two questions and just keep thinking of a question you might like to pose. So a question on the wider involvement of the parent and family constituency and the other around boys. What happens if boys are not included?
So actually, your questions are entirely intertwined. To answer your question in brief, you can't. You can't empower young women without addressing the systemic challenges that they face. And so I'm speaking on behalf of CamFed. The executive director is right there. But they have a diversity of programs that help to ensure that not only are they able to support girls in getting to school and learning, but they are able to support a community-wide change. And they do so by providing life skills courses, which are offered to both girls and boys. By creating pathways for community engagement in school life, and by explicitly working with parents, to the second question, thinking about how they can empower them also to participate in school, to feel welcome at school. I don't know as much as I should about British education. But in Tanzania, oftentimes, particularly secondary schools, are a separate entity. While they are located within communities, they are somehow elevated and less accessible to parents and other members of the community. There is a social divide that can be quite uncomfortable. And so one thing that I've seen CamFed do in a powerful way is try to break down those barriers and create access for parents and other community members to participate in these programs, to see the power of educating a girl, to address some of these social inequities head on, and to do so through really tangible means. Participating in provisioning of school lunch, for instance, participating in discussions about how to enhance learning outcomes at the school. These conversations are now happening, and that, I think, is kind of the entry point for addressing other systemic issues around inequity in girls' education.
I definitely think that just like with the migrants, you can't just help the migrant children, but you should also let the local children to understand what's happening in their city. And actually, 2 years ago, there was news about in a different city of China where parents, there was some school rearrangements going on, and a group of migrant children need to use the school site of a public school, and the parents were asking the school principals to build a wall to separate the migrant children from the local children. Actually, that was when we realized, oh, you also need to talk to the local parents and their kids. So that's why we started doing programs with the local kids about taking them to the shanty towns in the country, in the city, and also having them photograph and interview the villagers. So about the involvement with the parents, actually, it's really hard. Yes, it's really, really hard, because the first thing we have to do is actually to let them trust us. We're doing fine with their kids. Their kids are not being taken to some strange places, or because actually there's a really low social trust environment that we're operating on. So we actually first have to establish our legitimacy among the parents before actually getting them to support and participate in what we're doing. So that's what we've been trying to do. And we're now experimenting with online technologies like actually QQ groups, not WeChat groups, but QQ groups with the parents, so that they get to know what's happening with their kids, and so that they also get to know what they can do further. But yes, that's an area that we definitely want to work on.
And I know you've got something to add?
I think possibly this question might be coming on to the limits of what you can, it might be kind of approaching what the limits of what you can do as an NGO or a charity trying to tackle a specific issue like educational disadvantage or in particular contexts, because a lot of the time it's not that parents don't care about their kids' education, it's that they haven't got the resources to be able to get more involved with it, and that is something that, say, as Schools Plus, we're not able to do. But I do think what Ariel and Lisa have said about involving the parents in that in kind of more of an information campaign is a really valuable thing as well.
Okay, thank you. I'm aware that we've got an audience up the top, but we would need you, if you wanted to ask a question, we'd invite you to do that. You might need to just find your way down to the floor here. Or is there a mic up there? So any question from up the top? You've got a higher wisdom sitting up there. No? Any questions from below here then? But I do invite anyone up the top, just because you're up the top. We're not trying to ignore you. Okay, question here. So the question here, and I think there was a question here and one over there. So perhaps we'll start with you over there because we're just closer to you. So your name and your question.
I'm Wei from Engineering Department, Cambridge. I have a rather practical question for all of you. So as NGOs, how do you operate in a sort of financially sustainable manner?
Okay, excellent question. Two more questions here.
Ms. Borishevich, a fantastic amount that NGOs do. But as you advise on policy, how do you prevent an NGO moving from policy advice to becoming a political movement in its own right, particularly when you face the problems that you see in education?
Mm-hmm. And then one final question, I think. No? Okay. Back there. Okay.
So I was really encouraged to hear about your work with the older children in the Clover Youth project and what you were deciding to teach them. And there seemed to be this massive jump. Suddenly said, oh, you're about to go to work. Right, we need to get you some life skills. And I feel like, having sort of seen my own children through the education system, there's a huge gap between what they learned at school and what they're going to need to know when they start looking for a job. And I just wondered how much of what you're doing can feed back into our education systems.
Okay, so, panel, the questions, one around the financial sustainability, which I'm sure absolutely does exercise every single international, national, non-governmental organisation. The issue around policy advice and the kind of the space between that advice and being a kind of big political movement, and the involvement of older children.
I guess I'll first speak with the financial sustainability part. It's really a struggle, and you struggle every year, and struggle in different ways. We didn't have individual donors before. We applied grants, tried to write proposals. It was actually easier because formal processes. But then we start having to mobilize actually every one of you almost that would just make small donations on their cell phone. So we have to have different skill sets, try to mobilize individual donors. And we actually use some of the online crowdfunding platforms and mostly domestic ones in China. But I guess for now, what we're trying to do is to find our donor base who are willing to actually grow with us. And actually, in our scale, we're not like suddenly expanding to all over China. So actually for us, what we really focus on is to find donors that are willing to grow with us for 3 years, 5 years, and then we use that money to make sure that we get at least 50% of our costs covered, and then we spend our extra energy trying to do smaller public fundraising, and then also work with enterprises, companies, and yeah, so it's a very diversified approach.
Yeah, and for student hubs, we get some centralised funding for kind of various projects we run from trusts and foundations, but then we also get funding which is project specific. So because we work with a lot of students, some of it comes from university departments. So Schools Plus is funded by the Widening Participation Department at the uni.
Well, and as a separate comment, I think, interestingly, funding and the sustainability of programming or access to funds is increasingly related to what we were talking about earlier regarding assessment, monitoring and evaluation. So, I mean, I think that is a rather large incentive for nonprofit organizations to engage in really rigorous M&E activities, without which they would often lose access to a significant amount of funding, particularly through entities such as DFID or USAID.
What about the question of that divide between policy advice and political movement? Is that a challenge to any of you?
I don't think there should be a divide. I think especially when you're talking about education and empowerment of young people, you shouldn't prevent it from becoming political.
So
yeah,
education is political?
Yes.
Okay. Yes.
Well, not education is political, but a lot of the policy advice that would come out of the work that NGOs do. It was interesting because I think you used the word prevention. How do you prevent those two things? And my gut response was, well, why would you want to? And I could be misinterpreting it, but I guess thinking about the way that CamFed operates, they are able to, as a growing NGO, with a very strong international standing, to provide advice to the governments with whom they work, both in the UK and in the 5 African countries with whom they partner. And then, I mean, I was speaking about CAMA. I believe they've become a political movement inspired by the values underpinning CamFed and growing every year. And I view that as a strength rather than a weakness. But maybe we're misinterpreting.
So if I can come back on that,
yeah.
There is a real risk on this, because you either become pro the establishment that is already in a given setting, or you become a speaker for the opposition in democratic systems. And then you become tarred with a brush of all of the other policies that those entities actually embrace. And so you lose the independence of your direct mission by actually enshrining yourself with a movement that is not of itself maybe political, but subscribed to a particular political agenda within a country. And therefore, at that point, you cease to be an NGO. You actually become something completely different. And that affects your donor base and funding, because at the same time, others may not wish to support the other entities that you would embrace as part of that movement. That's the risk.
I think I agree, and it is a problem, but then at the same time, you've got to understand that the issues you're working with don't just exist in a vacuum, and so I don't think you're going to achieve significant change if you're just trying to tackle that one issue. But yeah, it's a risk, and then you become something else.
Well, sorry, go ahead.
I think the environment is rather different in China, where actually NGOs try to depoliticize themselves, so that, yes, we try not to say directly we're tackling some failure of some system, but to us it's more like a strategy, but that there's clearly something that we're saying by integrating the students. What we actually doing with the program is to help them integrate, but then it's not, in a sense, completely aligned with what policymakers in the local government would wish. But then to me, it's more like a gray area that I'm always on the edge of, and try to make sure that we can still make sure we deliver the programs, because I think that's actually the most important. Absolutely. You know, that the kids, that they actually get to have those services that we want to deliver, and we don't get blacklisted because of some unknown issues. So yeah, we actually try to not make ourselves into try to not emphasize on the views that we might have in difference.
No, and I think pointing out, it's the way that the organization chooses to engage with government, chooses to become an ally, chooses to participate within existing committees that the government has formed, chooses to, rather than creating kind of a parallel system or a political movement that would be better aligned with the opposition, which you're right, I mean, in East Africa as well is a huge risk, choosing instead to make sure that your organization is aligned with working with instilling change within government entities and operating to a certain extent in lockstep with them in order to change their ideas from within rather than becoming some threatening force from without is incredibly important.
So the idea, I think, then is that what NGOs can do, really good ones, is that they really concentrate the focus on the issue and not let themselves get a big kind of agenda. We have time for one last question. Can you make...
Sorry, we didn't answer one of the other...
we'll go to the last question. I'm aware that we're on a countdown. We've got no more than 5 minutes and a transition, so we can maybe scoop that up as part of the final thoughts. So quick question, introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm Lucy Lake. I am the CEO of CamFed. I've been very much feeling for Lisa as an external researcher being confronted with some of the very challenging questions. But I will pick up on that very last challenging question because I think it is fundamental around the sea change that we need to see in education and why CamFed is structured uniquely, why we have CamFed, the international organization that engages directly with governments on policy change. So there we achieve the systemic change. But we are the anchor point for a movement of young people who represent those who are most marginalized, who are increasingly being the voice and representation around the table to lead to the social change. So I think it's that combination of systemic change and social change that an NGO, if structured, can achieve. And that's where I think we've got a real opportunity for sea change in education.
I'm going to draw this to a close, but I'm going to ask each of our presenters to, in just one sentence, reflect on what they themselves have learnt from their engagement as with an NGO. So, Xiang, start with you.
Yeah,
one sentence.
Yes, I think I would say that don't ever estimate what a small initiative can go. And the reason why it goes on is also not just because of the initiative itself, but that the community's support to make it continue.
Great. Nice response. Eleanor.
Yeah, echoing that, just the amount of passion and engagement there is in the local community, either in the kind of university student body or then also beyond that to actually change an issue.
Okay, Lisa.
Yeah, I'm echoing the same thing. It's the passion and enthusiasm that drives NGOs as a sector, as the third sector, that I think has really inspired me and made me want to contribute.
So all of us, we've had 3 fantastic, stimulating, imaginative presentations from people who are out there getting their boots dirty. Raewyn Connell talks about this as the real grounded theory. You're out there in it all. So I'd like all of you to join with me and thank each of those presenters for their presentation. Thank you.